We just fixed a big flaw with the FBI's ballistics gel testing protocol. Here's how we did it. Hi, and welcome back to LocaCarnivore once again. As always, I'm your host, Nigel, the slightly better than average ninja, and today we're going to talk about how we found and fixed a big flaw in the FBI's ballistic gel test protocols for handgun bullets. And we're going to show you how we fixed that, as we told you in the intro. And just a real quick note, if you like seeing the content we produce for you, if you want to see more of it and better quality, we can't do that without your support, and we just really urge you, please go visit that link at Patreon. It'll be down in the description. Give us a look, and if you feel like it's worthwhile, please just make a contribution. Help you to have better content. We'd love to do that for you, but as you know, none of this is free, so thank you for that. Now, basically what we're talking about is the FBI's heavy clothing testing protocol that they use when they test handgun bullets in ballistic gelatin, and we're using Clear Ballistics Gel brand gelatin blocks. We found after quite a bit of research, we think this is really the best thing. I know there's a lot of debate out there, but that's fine. We think this is a really good medium to do the testing, and really all we're doing is an analog. It can never completely duplicate what happens in the field. But what the FBI testing protocol is, when it comes to heavy, quote, what they think is winter clothing, is they specify a cotton t-shirt, then some flannel fabric, and then some 200 gram, polar fleece, 200 type weight material, and then faced with one layer of relatively heavy denim fabric. Now that's what they think are heavy winter clothing. Anybody that lives north of, say, Santa Fe, New Mexico, and especially if you live Colorado, Wyoming, up north through Canada and in Alaska, you know that that's laughable. That is not heavy winter clothing. If you wore that kind of winter clothing on a cold January day in Havre, Montana, or Fairbanks, Alaska, you'd freeze to death in very short order. So realistically, what people wear is much heavier stuff. For example, when I go out in the winter, I'll usually have a wicking t-shirt layer on, and then a flannel shirt, or cotton or wool flannel shirt, and then a polar fleece top, midweight, lighter weight or midweight, and then on top of that I'll have a big jacket that will, it's big and puffy, and it's usually insulated with either high loft polyester synthetic filling, or it's insulated with down. So that's the kind of clothing that people wear up here, not just a light jean jacket and a fleece sweater or something like that over a t-shirt on a really cold day, and that's what you can expect. Now the other thing we have to consider is that research has shown, especially back in the 19th century, there were several biologists, a German and an American, who came up with the fact that in colder climates, organisms, animals are typically larger and heavier built than they are in warmer climates. It's called Bergmans rule and Allen's rule. And in essence, what those state is, like I said, everything is bigger. And if you go into, say, a farm supply store somewhere in Montana or Idaho or somewhere in northern Idaho, just stand around for 15, 20 minutes and you'll see people. It's not uncommon to see men walk through there who are well over 6 feet tall, usually even 6.5 feet, and they weigh 200-300 pounds easily. These are big men with big limbs. So the problem is how do you simulate that sort of thing? And on top of that, we need to take things to what we consider the worst case scenario. When an engineer designs something, they design to the worst case, knowing that anything less than that will be acceptable if a mechanism or whatever they're designing performs well in that worst case scenario. So here's what we need to do in order to make this more realistic for winter clothing and winter testing. The other thing we have to consider is shot presentation, shot placement in a defensive environment. And first of all, the FBI, they just have their layers of clothing in front of the block, just the single layers, and that assumes that the assailant is facing straight, squared up front towards you and is doing whatever they're going to do that requires you to shoot them. in a legal fashion. So they're just anticipating going through the initial layers and then into the gelatin block and doing their expansion and penetration data from there. That's not realistic. Anybody that watches any of the actual gunfights that are all over the internet like a rash quickly figures out that people don't just stand squared up an ideal 7 yards from each other like targets on a firing range. As soon as the lead starts flying, people start moving around. They're running, they're bobbing, they're weaving, they're ducking, they're doing all sorts of things. And it's not unusual for assailants to be shot not just in the front, but in the back, in the side, and more importantly, through their arm and then into the major part of their torso. And it's this shot kind of presentation and placement that created the biggest problem for the FBI in the infamous Miami shootout, which occurred in 1986, April of 1986. And in that shootout, one of the suspects, a man named Michael Platt, who weighed 210 pounds, was shot with one of the FBI's handguns. One of the agents shot him through the arm. It went through his bicep muscle, his right arm actually, through the bicep muscle, into the chest, and then penetrated into the chest cavity. It destroyed a substantial amount of the lung tissue in Mr. Platt. However, it wasn't sufficient to bring him down immediately. Mr. Platt stayed combat effective for close to 5 minutes, during which time he wounded several agents, and unfortunately he killed 2 very brave men, 2 brave FBI agents. So that shooting becomes the nightmare scenario that the FBI has tried to avoid ever since, and it's sort of a legendary thing in the defensive shooting community as well. Everybody's always thinking about that shot. So let's ramp that up to our big people in the North Country wearing heavy winter clothing, and we can see that very quickly we need to simulate a shot that goes through the arm on one of these very large men and then goes into their torso, and we have to have enough penetration in order to reach hopefully the heart, but certainly a good amount of the lung, preferably into the heart. So we need to revisit both the clothing that we use, the fabric we put over the gelatin blocks, and how we orient the gelatin blocks to simulate this. So what we've come up with here at LocaCarnivore is a much better, what we think is a much better system. We have what's called a clothing package, and that is a layer of t-shirt material, then a layer of flannel shirt material, then a layer of polar fleece, albeit this is kind of light, but still like a lightweight polar fleece. And then we took some polyester batting that would be used to make outdoor clothing, and we encapsulated that in some ripstop nylon, which is made for outerwear. It's outerwear grade ripstop nylon. And then what we're going to do is place that on the gelatin block. We're going to turn one gelatin block sideways, and then the other gelatin block will be the normal presentation, and the test bullet would be shot through this way. So bear with me. What we call this at LocaCarnivore, we have called this the frost giant, also known as a Jotun from Norse mythology, because that's what we're dealing with, is the worst case scenario, a frost giant, some man who's 6'5" or better and weighs 280 pounds or more. And it's not unusual to have, and this is a 6-inch wide block when the block's on section, so this is not that far off from the width of some of these men's arms. If you take a good look at them and start measuring them and put a tape measure on them, you find out that very quickly their arms are 4 to 6 inches thick, easily, at the bicep, at the upper area there. And then we need to have the other block turn the normal way to simulate the chest cavity in here. So we have, and if you think about it, the bullet has to not just go through the outer layer on the sleeve and then through the arm. It then has to go through the sleeve on the opposite side of the arm, and then the clothing that's on the torso as well. So you've got 3 packages of clothing you have to deal with, and that's what we're doing here. We would put one package of clothing on the front. The bullet would fire through here. It has to transit this initial, the arm if you will, this initial sideways present block, and then we've got 2 packages on the other side. So this is the inside sleeve, and then this is the torso covering, and then we have to get at least 12 inches of penetration in order to reach the heart. Even really big men like that, oddly enough, their shoulders, no matter how big they are still about 24 to maybe 28 inches wide, and that's their chest cavity, not just their shoulders, but their chest cavity. So that's a very interesting consistency in human beings. So you need, if it's 24 inches, this way you need to get at least 12 to get to the center where the heart is. So we would need an additional 12 inches. And then, as you recall, the FBI's penetration standard for a acceptable defensive round is 12 inches minimum, 18 inches maximum, with 16 being ideal. So if you've got 6 here and an additional 12, there's your 18 inches. So you need to get roughly that much penetration on this kind of a shot. And if a bullet can handle this environment, it would perform just as well if the clothing was just a single layer on the front of the block and you're shooting into the block. So what that's going to do for us is present a substantial challenge to any defensive bullet that we fire at our frost giant, because, as you know, many hollow points have problems when they hit fabric, and we're hitting them with a lot of fabric. They'll plug up, or they might expand initially, and then they've got to deal with more fabric again to get through to the actual vital area that we're measuring whether or not they can actually get into. Hey, we're back in the studio again. We had a little technical glitch out there in the field, so we had to cut short what we were doing. We got most of it accomplished, however, what we wanted to tell you. There's a few extra things I wanted to go over before we conclude the video. Okay, you saw the clothing packages we put together with the ripstop nylon, the polyester batting, another ripstop nylon layer, so that makes basically a jacket, the flannel, the fleece, and the t-shirt layers. That was not as much clothing as we could have put together. For instance, we did not include a layer of heavy wool garment. I don't know if you've ever seen a heavy wool top coat or the heavy wool shirts that were issued by the military a long time ago. They're still out there. Or just, you know, a heavy Pendleton shirt. Those add considerable resistance and considerable extra fibrosity, if you will, to the garmenting layer. So we could have put that in there as well, but we decided not to, for the reason that we didn't want to make this an extraordinarily difficult test. We just want to get it more along the lines of what you're most likely to encounter with somebody wearing heavy clothing in a northern climate in the winter. Or I could have put on something like this. This is a heavy-duty 650 fill power down parka. It's actually my old Cabela's Trans-Alaska parka from back in the day. But you can see this would add even more bulk to that clothing package. I debated on whether or not to put down in the equation. And to be blunt, because of the expense, we elected not to do that. Imagine the results we get with the layers that we did choose, and then ramp that up in your own mind and think, well, what if they had a heavy parka like this and a heavy wool shirt or wool vest underneath that, like one of those heavy Pendleton or Carhartt wool vests. Carhartt, so that's another thing, that really heavy-duty canvas, and then the hollow fill behind it, or the heavy, what they call Sherpa lining, which is just basically a shag carpet version of polar fleece. Don't get me started on why they went to that. But at any rate, that's even more layers and more resistance to get through. So you can see, depending on the result we get with the Jotun, with the Frost Giant, the way we have it set up, and then you can ramp up, depending on how well a bullet performs through that. If it performs marginally or poorly, you can imagine how badly it would work with even more clothing on. And if the bullet does very well with the clothing packages we've developed for the Frost Giant, you can then imagine what things would be like if, how much performance degradation you would probably see if there was even heavier layers on top of that individual. So we had to strike a balance. We didn't want to make the test so over the top that basically nothing would pretty much meet muster. We wanted to do a much better job than the FBI did with their protocols, make it much more realistic. Also wanted to share with you where we got the idea for the Frost Giant, for the Jotun. And basically, it was watching a lot of other videos, particularly Paul Harrell's videos, where he came up with what he calls the meat target. And in fairness to Paul, we like Paul's videos. We don't know the man, and we've never met him, but we do like Paul's videos. And in fairness to him, what he came up with is not, and he admits it, it's not a scientific test medium. It's just simply something he came up with for dramatic illustration of how bullets might perform when they hit, an actual assailant in the real world. And if anything, he at least uses the same methodology, so he has consistency across all of his tests. And that is a very good point indeed for Mr. Harrell. We've got a link to Paul's channel down in the description. We're not necessarily shilling for him or anything, but I just thought I like his videos so much. Go down there. If you haven't ever seen him before, go check him out. I think you'll really enjoy what he does. But the big problem we found with that meat target was, and let's be honest, and Paul knows it, it's not a very good analog for what happens in actual living tissue. And that's why I wanted to bring gel into it. And then looking at what he was doing and a few other people, what they were doing, the main issue that I saw was a lack of repeatability in a valid test medium. So we went to the gel, we looked at the FBI protocol, found, as we've told you many, many times, that it's plainly ridiculous, and decided, well, what can we do to improve that? So based on those ideas, we then came up with this idea of the Frost Giant. And just so you know, the other thing we decided to do is we wanted to be much more accurate in using the clear ballistics gelatin than a lot of other people out there. You watch these gel tests on the internet. It's obvious that some people know what they're doing, they understand the test medium, and there's other people who don't have a clue. And I'm not going to call anybody out, but the basic problem is primarily the temperature that they do the shooting, the block temperature and the ambient temperature. I spoke with technical people at Clear Ballistics Gelatin before we made our decision as to what test medium we were going to use. I was looking very heavily at Simtech. That's the stuff that Don over at TN Outdoors 9 has used for a very long time, and that looked like a very good product. Trouble is, it's not, let's be blunt, it's not very photogenic, and if it doesn't come out good on camera, then it loses some of its interest. So we wanted to maintain that and find a good test medium. At any rate, talked to the technical people there at Clear Ballistics Gel, and they were extremely informative, very helpful folks, very open about their product and their data. And the main thing was they specified that the block is at its best when it's at a temperature between 60 and 70 degrees Fahrenheit. So we do endeavor to make sure that we're in that envelope. So basically, if you're out there and you're in the middle of Alaska and it's obvious it's probably it's below freezing or even closer to 0 Fahrenheit, your blocks are too cold. They're too resistant, so you're not getting good data there. And conversely, if you're out in the middle of the Arizona desert and we can see you're sweating and it's a hot day and your clear ballistics blocks are about ready to melt into your test table or whatever's holding them up, you're wrong too. It's much too warm for that. So you've got to find that place where you can get that proper temperature. Now that does limit us to when we can actually do our shooting. So that means that some of our videos might not be as, we might not get the pace of production out that you see for a lot of other people. We want to make sure we're as right as we possibly can be. Is it scientific research, what we're doing? No. If it was scientific, we would have at least 100 shots, if not 500 shots, a good sample set. Also, we would have highly controlled conditions. Temperature would be spot on every single time, indoors, air conditioned, the whole smash. We'd have slow-mo, super slow-mo and all these sorts of things. And we just don't have those things. So, but what we're trying to do is develop a test protocol that is A, consistent and repeatable across every test we do. So there's no variable there as far as the test media or the test conditions. And second, we wanted to just do something to be illustrative of how a particular bullet performs under those circumstances. It's not the end-all be-all, but it's much better than what the FBI is doing, to be honest with you, and it's much better than what a lot of other people are out there doing. So we're trying to work very hard to make sure you're getting as good information as we provide to you, albeit it is for entertainment. Thank you for giving us your time and watching our video today. We really appreciate it. And there's a lot of other things you could do with it, your time, and you chose to spend it with us. We hope you found it very rewarding and informative. As always, remember to like us, subscribe, ring that bell, comment, support us on Patreon, and share the video. Tell the world about us. We'd really love that, to be blunt, free publicity, but if you could carry the water for us on that, we'd really like it. And don't forget to stay to the very end of the video. We'll give you a quick laugh like we always do. Hopefully you'll find it amusing. We work very hard to come up with those little vignettes that we put on there. Yeah, we're very hard on that sort of thing. And we'll see you next time on LocaCarnivore. Have a great day.